Shabbat Shalom. So the story tells us about two women, determined, smart, diametrically opposed women. One is beautiful and one is ugly. One is magnanimous, the other is vindictive. One is beloved and the other is hated. And that is essentially all we know about them in spite of their prominence in the story. For a long time, I didn't even notice their shockingly underdeveloped personas. I never thought to question the absence of the fullness of their humanity. I might have felt a vague dissatisfaction with their unsophisticated portrayal, but that was it. It wasn't until I experienced a fascinating midrash reimagining this pair at the center of their own story that my whole world was magically transformed. And that is the power of midrash, the rabbinic interpretations of the original text that are often boldly juxtaposed with the initial portrayal. And right now I am particularly captivated by this specific midrash once again. And of course, I'm talking about Wicked. Yeah, because Wicked is really the first midrash I ever encountered, and honestly, I don't think I could be the rabbi I am if I didn't have that. Have you seen the film adaptation yet? Oh, okay. So if you haven't, what are you waiting for? I mean, right after Shabbos, you're getting your tickets, okay? Please, I'll go with you. I will go and see this movie again and again. And if you have, please come find me later so we can share in our mutual adoration of this masterpiece. We're friends, yeah, right? I doubt that L. Frank Baum, who authored The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, could have imagined the grip his story would continue to have on us 124 years later. How could he have possibly foreseen not just the resounding success of his original novel, but the impact of the many adaptations that followed? I've seen the original movie more times than I can count, and I love the fantastical nature of the story, the colorful, whimsical, terrifying world of Oz. I never questioned the obvious goodness of Glinda and wickedness of her unnamed green counterpart. I mean, it wasn't exactly a subtle aspect of their characters. It's right there in their names, literally Glinda, the good witch of the north, and the green one is known as the wicked witch of the west. It's really the only thing we know about them. But Gregory Maguire's book, published 95 years after L. Frank Baum's classic novel, twisted the well-known tale into something totally unexpected. He audaciously reinvented these beloved characters, contradicting most of what we had assumed about them from their original depiction. And when I read that book, it was a revelation. I simply didn't know you could do that you could take a character and make it your own. It feels deliciously subversive. And then, when this musical theater kid got to see the original Broadway cast in Wicked, I mean, I nearly melted from the intensity of my obsession. I'm telling you, I've listened to that soundtrack more times than I think is healthy for any one human being. I have been utterly consumed by this latest film adaptation starring Cynthia Erivo and Ariana Grande. It has gripped me in a way that is hard to describe. Yes, the magnificence of their voices is undeniable, but I am so in awe of the relationship they created between one another, both on and off screen. I admit I have indulged in a Wicked-only stream of content since I saw the film, and I can reassure you it's the best corner of the internet. So how could I possibly read this week's Torah portion, Parashat Vayetze, without aching for a similar reimagining for our matriarchs, Rachel and Leah? We meet these two important women for the first time in this parsha, and we think we know them well. But the Torah is actually pretty stingy in the information it gives us about Leah and Rachel. The insight we have into their characters is mostly limited to the ways in which they are essential in the storylines of the men in their lives, their father Lavan and their husband Jacob. We know a few things about them, obviously. Leah and Rachel are sisters. Sidebar, this is actually kind of remarkable. Rachel and Leah are the only pair of sisters that we ever really meet in the entire Hebrew Bible, in the entire Tanakh. So many of our stories revolve around the complex relationship between brothers, even between brother and sister, but only this story attempts to explore the relationship between sisters. Back to the main topic. Okay, so Leah and Rachel are sisters, daughters of Lavan, who is a shrewd, manipulative man who maneuvered his children in whatever way was beneficial to him, regardless of the impact his actions had on them. His callousness towards his daughters is objectively cruel. Leah and Rachel both marry Jacob, who declares his boundless love for Rachel many times and makes his displeasure with Leah equally well known. Like his father-in-law Lavan, Jacob never seems to consider the discord he might be sowing between these sisters. And not surprisingly, Jacob also doesn't seem to be concerned with how his feelings towards his wives will inevitably sow discord among his sons. As Rachel and Leah battle to birth babies for Jacob, he is conspicuously absent. The mothers bestow names upon their children, most of which reflect the acrimonious feelings they have towards one another and the suffering they experience because of their predicament. They continuously vie for Jacob's attention. Each of them display a somewhat unflattering envy of the other. They each want what the other has. And sadly, neither of them get a fairy tale happily ever after ending. And the rabbis step in and they create many midrashim which further explain Leah and Rachel's narrative and suggest a more complex characterization for them. Here are some that I thought were particularly interesting. The Torah describes Rachel and Leah this way. Lavan had two daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes. Rachel was shapely and beautiful. It's obvious to me that the plain intention of the text is to insinuate Leah's weak eyes or soft eyes or gentle eyes are a feature that is the absolute opposite of Rachel's desirable beauty, even if the exact meaning of that phrase is unclear. The rabbis, however, expand on this ambiguous description and completely reinterpret Leah's weak eyes as praise for her character. This is what we read in the Talmud in Bava Batra. The verse means that her eyes were literally weak, and this is not a denigration of her, but a praise of her. As she would hear people at the crossroads coming from the land of Canaan who would say, Rebecca has two sons, and her brother Lavan has two daughters, and the younger daughter will be married to the younger son, and the older daughter will be married to the older son. And Leah would sit at the crossroads and ask, okay, so tell me a little bit about the older son. What are these deeds of the older son? And the passersby would answer, he is an evil man who robs people. And then she'd ask, well, what are the deeds of the younger son? And they would answer, he's a quiet man who dwells in tents. And because she was so distraught at the prospect of marrying the evil brother, she would cry and pray for mercy so hard that her eyelashes fell out. Since the weakness of her eyes was due to this cause, characterizing them as weak constitutes praise. I really appreciate this midrash in trying to transform this insult into a demonstration of Leah's righteousness. She's just a woman who dreams of a good-hearted partner. and is devastated at the possibility that she might be doomed to live out her days in wickedness. Her grief is manifested in this unattractive physical feature, but the midrash argues that her diminished beauty is evidence of her sincere eagerness to be good. It isn't a critique, it's a badge of honor. Another midrash reimagines the infamous wedding mix-up, remember that? Jacob worked for Laban for 7 years in order to marry his beloved Rachel, and he is incensed when he discovers the morning after the wedding that his bride-to-be had been swapped out for her older, presumably uglier, and certainly unloved sister Leah. Now, the Torah doesn't concern itself with the devastation and betrayal Rachel must have felt, or the motivation behind Leah's complicity in this deceit. It solely focuses on Jacob's reaction and Laban's smug response. Here's one of the midrashim the rabbis offer as insight into Leah and Rachel's experience. At that moment, Rachel, our mother, jumped up before Adonai and said, "Master of the universe, you know that Jacob, your servant, loved me a great love and worked for my father for 7 years for me. And when the 7 years were up and the time came for me to be married to my husband, my father devised a plan to have my sister switch places with me for my husband. And this was very difficult for me. As I heard about the plan, I swallowed my suffering and had mercy on my sister so that she would not be shamed in public. On the evening of what should have been my wedding, my sister took my place with my husband instead of me. I gave her all the secret signs that I had given my husband so that he would think that she was me. And not only that, I laid under the bed where he laid with my sister, and when he spoke with her, she was silent, and I answered, each time so that he wouldn't recognize her voice. I acted with loving kindness towards her, and I wasn't jealous of her. I refused to put her to shame. What a stark contradiction to the relationship between these sisters in the midrash and the one that the Torah portrays. Pretty much every interaction between Leah and Rachel in the original text is laden with bitterness and competition and jealousy. But in this midrash, we see a different possibility, that perhaps these two women loved each other and sacrificed for one another. Perhaps they weren't locked in some cruel, unwinnable battle with one another. Instead, maybe they protected each other as they both tried to navigate a world that rendered them mostly powerless. Another midrash imagines Leah reciprocating this consideration for her sister. In the Talmud in Tractate Berachot, we read, Rav Yosef cited the following verse, "And afterwards, Leah bore a daughter and named her Dinah." What's meant by the word afterwards? Rav said, after Leah had passed judgment on herself, saying, 12 tribes are destined to issue from Jacob. 6 have come from me, and 2 from each of the handmaids, making a total of 10. If this child I am carrying is a boy, my sister Rachel will not be equal even to one of the handmaids. Immediately, the child she was carrying was transformed into a girl. So, setting aside, for our purposes, the misogynist assumptions implicit in this text, we see that Leah is protecting Rachel, sacrificing her own desires to spare her sister from the public humiliation of a diminished social status. It is tragically ironic that Rachel, who so desperately yearns to be a mother, dies giving birth to her second son, Benjamin, the son that Leah prayed she would have. And there are other really fascinating midrashim about these matriarchs. And even though the rabbis add nuance and complexity to the characters of Leah and Rachel through these interpretations, nothing I found did what I wanted it to. None of them were wicked enough, if you know what I mean. So this theater rabbi, decided to create my own midrashic monologue, which I humbly offer to you as my interpretation of part of Rachel and Leah's story told through the perspective of Leah's gentle eyes. It's true, my sister and I didn't always get along, but we were much more alike than some others would have you believe. Were we competitive? Yes. Okay. Were we jealous of each other? Obviously. But, having a sister isn't easy, and that's without being married to the same man. But I loved Rachel. For all of our differences, I loved her, and she loved me. Regardless of whether we were fighting or felt betrayed by one another, we still knew that we would always be there for each other. I miss her so much. I was by her side when she struggled to give birth to Joseph, and it was utterly terrifying to watch her endure such pain. She squeezed my hand so hard, I thought she was going to break it. But when her son, my nephew, finally entered this world, his piercing wail was the most beautiful melody I had ever heard. She was such a good mother. She doted on Joseph every second of every day, and Jacob was right by their side in a way he never showed up for any of my children or the sons born to him by Bilhah and Zilpah, but that's another story. After her difficult delivery with Joseph, the midwives told Rachel that having another child would probably kill her. I begged her to stop trying to get pregnant. I reminded her that Jacob's grandmother, Sarah, she only had one child. There's no shame in that. But Rachel was stubborn sometimes, and she had imagined herself being a mother to a nation. And Joseph was her miracle, and she was convinced that she was destined for more miracles. I was skeptical. I was always more skeptical than she was about everything. That was kind of our role. She got to be the dreamer, and I tethered her to reality. She might have miraculously survived birthing her first child, but but one can never depend on a miracle happening twice. And when she discovered she was pregnant with her second son, I felt nothing but dread. And she didn't admit it, but I saw how her body was weaker than it had been with Joseph, how tired she was, how little she could eat, how, in spite of her most ardent efforts, she just wasn't physically capable of even tending to her son. And Jacob, for all his declarations of love, seemed to ignore Rachel's fragile condition. He didn't even slow down the journey. Traveling is hard on anybody, but it's particularly grueling and dangerous for a woman in the midst of a difficult pregnancy. Maybe he didn't want to recognize how bad things were getting, or maybe he naively thought that if we pressed on, that we could make it to our destination, where Rachel could safely deliver her child in a proper home. And maybe he was just too arrogant, confident that God would never allow something to happen to her, to his beloved wife and her child. But he was wrong. He was so wrong. And I will never forgive him for that. When Rachel went into labor, it was too early. We all knew it was too early. The baby was coming too soon, and I just tried to hide my panic and send for the midwives. I tried to reassure Rachel that everything would be fine. I told her I knew she was about to have another healthy son, and I saw her try to believe me, and I think that gave her a little strength at first, but it just wasn't enough. And this time as she labored, she was too weak to really even hold my hand, let alone break it. She was pale. She was so startling how pale she was. and the hours of agony dragged on with no sign of it relenting. After a particularly prolonged stretch of pain, she turned to me and commanded that I look into her eyes, her strong and beautiful eyes. And to swear to her that I would protect her children. As fiercely as I protected my own. She knew she wasn't going to make it. I knew it too. But I didn't want to believe it. I told her to put those thoughts out of her mind. She was so close to bringing this child into this world, but she just snapped at me impatiently and said, "Don't lie to me. I don't have much more time, and I can't die until you promise me this." Of course, I said to her, Of course I will protect your children. And then I told her how sorry I was for all the petty nonsense between us, and even more sorry for the cruelty I sometimes unleashed on her. But she didn't even really let me explain. She cut me off and she said, "I know. I am too." And in the midst of this chaos, we somehow found a peace with one another that I never thought we would have. And that reprieve was short-lived. Another wave of pain gripped her, and she cried out in this terrifying, unrecognizable, kind of inhuman sound. She struggled to breathe, and the midwives told her she needed to push one more time, and she summoned every last bit of strength, and she pushed it. And suddenly there was that glorious melody of a newborn's wail. And for a moment, I almost believed that she had been right all along, that this would be another miracle and she and her son would survive. But then her hand slipped from mine. Midwives worked quickly in vain to try and stop the bleeding. One of them handed me Rachel's son, and I placed that beautiful baby in her arms, and she looked at him and whispered his name with her last breath. And she was gone. She was just gone. The day we buried Rachel in that foreign, unfamiliar soil, I couldn't stop thinking about how lonely it would be for her there. How devastatingly short her life was, how painfully unfulfilled her dreams would be, and I was overcome. I cradled Benjamin in my arms and began to speak over Rachel's grave. My sister wanted nothing more than to be a mother, I said. A mother, not just to one or two children, but to an entire nation. So we will give her in death what she couldn't achieve in her life. From now until the end of time, all of our children will be her children too. She is Rachel Imenu, Rachel, our mother. In my imagination, Leah has no more children, but she does bestow a new name for her sister. No more bitterness, no more competition, no more jealousy. This is the legacy I dream of for these sisters, a world in which they were able to conquer their envy and embrace their sincere, selfless love for one another. I leave you with the words from Elphaba and Glinda in the song For Good. And just to clear the air, I ask forgiveness for the things I've done you blame me for. But then I guess we know there's blame to share, and none of it seems to matter anymore. Who can say if I've been changed for the better? I do believe I have been changed for the better. And because I knew you, I have been changed for good. Shabbat Shalom.